My name is Matthew Continetti, a senior fellow here at the American Enterprise Institute, and author of the forthcoming The Right, The 100-Year War for American Conservatism, which will be published next month. But today's event is another in a series of Edward and Helen Hintz book forums here at AEI. These forums provide a platform to host prominent authors for discussion of their books on issues of national significance. And I know that all of us at AEI, as well as the authors of those books, are grateful to Edward and Helen Hintz for their tremendous support of AEI and deep commitment to the mission of this institution. Joining me this afternoon is Stephen F. Hayward, a resident scholar at the University of California, Berkeley's Institute of Government Studies and a visiting lecturer at Berkeley Law. Popular blogger at Powerline.com, or rather PowerlineBlog.com, Stephen is the author of 6 books, including the 2-volume Age of Reagan, Greatness, Reagan, Churchill, and the Making of Extraordinary Leaders, and one of my favorites, Patriotism is Not Enough, Harry Jaffa, Walter Burns, and the Arguments That Redefined American Conservatism. We're here, though, to talk about Steve's latest biography, M. Stanton Evans, Conservative Wit, Apostle of Freedom, which is available now from Encounter Books, and I urge everyone to read it, especially those of us who are interested in the history of the American conservative movement. I look forward to a fascinating and, I hope, interactive discussion. If you are watching our live stream, please feel free to ask questions for Steve about his book by emailing john.roach@aei.org. That's john.roach, R-O-A-C-H, @aei.org. Or by using the hashtag AEIEvans, E-V-A-N-S, on Twitter. So the life of Medford Stanton Evans follows the arc of the post-war American conservative movement. Evans was born in Texas on July 20th, 1934, and shares a name with his father, Medford Evans, a professor of English and a rock-ribbed anti-communist. Medford Evans's experiences at the American Energy Commission during the end of World War II and its aftermath convinced him of the dangers of communist subversion and of the necessity of imposing security protocols to rid the federal government of insidious forces working from within. Stan Evans shared both his father's anti-communism and his interest in the English language. Stan matriculated at Yale in the fall of 1951, not long after William F. Buckley Jr. wrote God and Man at Yale, attacking the university for abandoning its traditions of Christianity and free markets. After graduation from Yale, Stan wrote for the Freeman magazine, Human Events, and National Review, before becoming the editor of the Indianapolis News at the age of 26. That same year, 1960, Stan was the primary author of the Sharon Statement, the founding charter of the Young Americans for Freedom, which serves as a creed for post-war American conservatism. Before he died at the age of 80 in 2015, Stan Evans wrote 11 books, chaired the American Conservative Union, and founded the National Journalism Center, an independent training program for aspiring journalists that is now part of the Young Americans for Freedom. Steve, thank you so much for returning to AEI and joining me to discuss this exemplary yet extraordinary life.
Well, thank you. It's great to be here again.
I guess I'd just begin by asking, what drew you to Stan Evans as a person? How did your life intersect with his? And then what led you to write this biography?
You know, I grew up with him in a certain way. I was such a nerd. This is in the 70s. I was such a nerd that when the LA Times arrived in the morning, and that's back when it was a real newspaper that actually had 5 sections and was thick, I'd read the op-ed page first, ahead of the sports section, which at the time it didn't strike me as being unusual, but I guess it is. And Stan was carried by the Los Angeles Times Syndicate, and the Times ran his column often. I also subscribed to Human Events in high school. Okay, and he was such a stalwart. But then I think what most impressed me or left its mark was I used to hear his radio commentaries on Spectrum, which was a CBS News commentary series, and they'd be 3-4 minutes long, and his voice was so captivating. And although I had read his writing, you hear somebody, and I thought how terrific he was at that form. And so then when I graduated from college and thought I want to be a writer or a journalist, but didn't really know how to go about it, I saw the ad in National Review for his National Journalism Center, which was then about a year old. And $100 a week. in Washington. Almost real money 40-some years ago. And so I applied and was accepted. And, that got to know him and kept up with him ever since. Now, as for how this biography came about, I really do owe a big shout out to Neil Freeman, longtime fixture in the conservative movement. I don't actually know Neil that well, but he called me up out of the blue 3-4 years ago, and he says, I think there needs to be a biography of Stan Evans. What would you think about trying to write it? And I immediately thought, what a great idea, because I love Stan, and I'd never done formal biography before. My 2 Reagan books are political narrative, which is a little easier to do. So it was a challenge, a lot of gaps, hard to find things, but I just had a great time doing the research and the writing.
It is a remarkable project of Neil Freeman, who was assisted William F. Buckley Jr. when he formed Firing Line and became a fixture in the conservative movement ever since the show premiered in 1966, the year after Buckley ran for mayor. But he has also sponsored biographies of other important conservatives, from Wilmore Kendall to, I think there's one in progress on Frank Meyer, one on Brent Bozell that was published. So it is a wonderful project of Neil's.
Yeah, I think it's really important we keep alive the stories and memories of our heroes and intellectual leaders from the past. So no, it's a very significant project, and I'm glad to be part of it.
So maybe that's the place to start in talking about the heroes and the significant figures in kind of the formation of Stan Evans, right?
Yeah.
I mentioned his father, but there are a couple of other figures too that I think bear mentioning. One is Frank Chattarov.
Right.
Who was Frank Chattarov, and what effect did he have on the conservative movement?
Yeah, so that's an almost completely forgotten figure from the 30s to sometime in the mid-50s or late 50s, I guess you'd say. He was always known as, I guess you'd say, a purebred libertarian. In fact, he liked to say, if you call me conservative, you're going to get punched in the nose. He was very much a free marketeer. Also very much, you might say, a fierce adherent of the old rights, Robert Taft, for example, non-interventionist mentality. So he actually got fired from, I forget what publication or institution it was, for opposing our entry into World War II. Not because he had any German sympathies like some people did in the America First movement. He did it on principle. But Stan had started reading him while Stan was a student at Yale, and a lot of Chattarov's work, I went back and dug a lot of it out, because I had heard of him years ago and read a few things, but put it aside. And a lot of it holds up pretty well about the decay of the academy under the doctrines of Marxism and things that are now more familiar and more attenuated than ever today. And he had an attack on the income tax, Chattarov did, not on familiar grounds of inefficiency or distortions to the economy. Chattarov thought it was immoral, right? Taxation is theft kind of mentality, but stated much more elegantly than that is often put on bumper stickers. And he hired Stan right out of Yale to work at the Freeman. And Stan later said he learned a lot about how to be a professional journalist from Chattarov, who was a very skillful writer and editor. Stan had worked at the Yale Daily News, but he said, I still had a lot to learn getting out of college, and don't we all?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love the title of Chattarov's memoir, One is a Crowd.
Yes, right.
Shows you his individualism.
Yeah, Stan read that book while he was a student at Yale and was much taken with it. Yeah.
Maybe just let's spend a minute on Medford Evans,
Right.
who was an important figure in his own right. Tell us a little bit about Stan Evans' father, and also, it's impossible to measure the impact of the father on a son, but what do you think that Stan may have learned from Medford?
I think the key thing he took from and then emulated in his father was the worry that internal security was not being taken seriously by our government, except perhaps by Joe McCarthy. Mm-hmm. And we'll come back to that in a bit. But it's a very interesting story, because I couldn't figure out how his dad got from being a professor of English in Tennessee to being the head of security for first the Manhattan Project and then the Atomic Energy Commission for 2-3 years after the war. My hunch is, since he was in Tennessee, I'll bet he knew some people at Oak Ridge, where so much of that work was going on. This is just a guess, but it's the best I can come up with. Couldn't find any old documentation or anybody who knew. So they moved here to suburban Washington, and Stan actually spent his teenage years here in suburban Maryland. But his father resigned about, late 40s, early 50s, I forget the exact date, in dismay that he'd met Klaus Fuchs at Los Alamos in New Mexico, and then later Klaus Fuchs is part of the Rosenberg plot to steal the atom bomb secrets. And his dad, Medford, was convinced that there were a lot more security leakages that security for our atomic secrets was not being taken seriously. So he resigned in protest and went back to teaching. And Stan later, I think, thought his dad was right about all that.
So as you mentioned, Stan goes to Yale, he graduates, he's involved in conservative journalism at Yale, actually starts a conservative newspaper at Yale for the party of the right. And then he begins to work for the Freeman, for Human Events. You know, Human Events still exists as a website, but I'm not sure people fully appreciate its longevity and also its impact. So tell us about Human Events.
Right. I'm chuckling because it was so much fun to read for all those years when it was a tabloid that came out every week. At the time Stan joined, it had started in the late 40s, really as just a 4 or 8-page newsletter. It was still an 8-page newsletter at the time Stan signed on in, I think, 57 or thereabouts. And it usually consisted of short news items and one long-form essay. And of course, it grew very rapidly to the form we knew it from the 60s into the 2000s, more like 25, 30 pages every week. And it was very different from, say, National Review, which was always very erudite and philosophical. Catholic, of course, to some extent, as we all know. Human Events was always very slashing in its prose. Very, very good prose, but very straightforward, meat and potatoes reporting. And what I always loved about them was their blunt headlines. It was always something like, Reagan submits big government budget, right? Ford sells out to China. Nothing subtle about their headlines. and the articles were often pretty slashing too. Some of that was Stan, some of that was other people at Human Events like Alan Riskin, their longtime managing editor. But Stan really loved Human Events, and a lot of the work he did then in the late 50s I think was unsigned, these short little paragraphs, but you can kind of make out his style. I mean, National Review was fairly political, but Human Events really was. Really tracing out, especially liberal Republicans like Rockefeller, who they hated. They were an early champion in the late 50s of Barry Goldwater. They said, we've spotted somebody who's a man for the future, for the movement.
And they were based in D.C., right? Which
yes.
kind of lent them a certain insight and perspective, whereas National Review is in New York and at a remove. Yeah.
Right.
And another of Human Events fans, of course, as you well know and have written about, was a certain actor turned politician, right?
Right, yes.
Just dilate for a moment on Reagan at Human Events.
Well, the great stories from his presidency is that his staff, especially Mike Deaver, allegedly, I think correctly, tried to keep his copy of Human Events from getting to him, because Human Events was... Now, Stan and Human Events, they were very careful never to attack Reagan personally or to suggest that he was ideologically suspect, but they had no hesitation about attacking directly what they thought were policy failures and, above all, personnel mistakes. They really hated James Baker, right, and Richard Darman. What's the old joke? I didn't hear this from Stan, but why do people take an instant dislike to Darman? Saves time. That goes back to the Reagan years. Anyway, Reagan actually got a second subscription to Human Events to get around sent to the personal residence. And so they'd write something very harsh about what Reagan was doing. Sometimes Reagan, he said to them once in a meeting, I'm still reading you but enjoying it less, because he thought they weren't always accurate. But they were important to him. And so at least, I think, 3 occasions while Reagan was president, they'd run a tough article. Reagan's people, usually Ed Meese was behind this, but the president supported it, would call up Human Events, say, can you guys come in and have a meeting? We want to really explain what we think is going on and make our case. And that was usually David Stockman on arcane budget arithmetic. And then Reagan would always come in for 2 or 3 minutes, tell some jokes and, the kind of stuff Reagan would do. But there's a clever aspect of the way that worked. But I'll just say this, one more detail. Some of those meetings were pretty blunt, including Evans and James Baker coming to verbal blows, I'll put it that way. Not for the first time. He had the same experience with Henry Kissinger, which we can come back to perhaps if you want, under Nixon.
Yes, we'll get there.
But in one of those meetings, I think around 85, so kind of late in things, or at least in the middle, Reagan comes in and he says something like, so, as Stockman and the other people here, all the Baker, everybody's there to assail the Human Events people for having the story wrong. And they brought Stan along, Alan Riskin told me, because he really knew all the budget tricks, even though he hadn't written the piece that got them upset in, I think, 85. And Reagan comes in and he says, the fellow straightened you out. And he says, by the way, he says, Alan and Tom Winter, the latest copy came and there was a printing error. It was all smudged. And And then the page jump that was incorrect, and Nancy and I were holding it up to the light, and it was only afterwards that people there thought, then he's out in 2 minutes because he had a very busy day. Reagan did. So what they said was, one of the things we realized afterwards was, on the one hand, Reagan was upset with the criticism from us, and on the other hand, he wanted to convey to Baker and all the rest of them that human events is important to me.
How closely he paid attention.
Exactly, and why, you guys, so clever that way, right?
I want to stay here just for a moment, because reading your book and reading Stan and the role that publications like Human Events had, and we'll get into more detail about this, in criticizing Republican politicians, even conservative politicians, and the argument. I'm reading in your book and reliving these moments, and I'm saying to myself, when did the right get so sensitive, right? When did all of a sudden you have to be on one team, right? You have to be a team player.
Right.
Do you sense that do we still do the same thing as conservatives? Well, or are we more sensitive to criticism because the perceived enemy to the left takes precedence?
I think there's 2 or 3 things to be said about that. One is, even well into the 70s, people like Evans and the American Conservative Union and other organizations thought, we have liberal Republicans, we don't like them. They're also conservative Democrats, so we shouldn't make conservatism a partisan matter. That's, of course, largely disappeared now, as we know. So that was one aspect of it. And in fact, it's in the book, as Reagan and Bill Rush are going down to meet George Wallace in the mid-70s to see maybe we should have a third party. Okay. The other thing is, Evans was very early on to Republicans who we thought were, today we call them rhinos, but someone he disliked from the earliest days was Richard Lugar. When he was running for mayor of Indianapolis, Evans wrote editorials criticizing Lugar when Lugar was on the school board for Indianapolis. So he was never sort of surprised later that Lugar became, grown in office okay.
One of Obama's favorite Republicans.
Right, exactly. But I think by far the biggest thing is this. Evans thought the single biggest mistake conservative politicians made, whatever their degree on the conservative spectrum, was accepting the premises of the liberal establishment in the media and the Washington community. He thought once you do that, you already lost the fight, whatever it is. Whether it's, this has to be a compromise, but it's always a compromise on the liberal. So he always thought, this is why I think he might have liked some of Trump's disposition. Hard to know, but he thought conservatives ought to have a much more of a bulldog disposition in rejecting the premises of the media, the liberal establishment. Any problem that comes along, the default position of a liberal is, we have to have a government solution, more spending, more regulation, more of a program. Mm-hmm. And then Republicans would always have half a loaf, right? Or the phrase I always used to use was the Conservative Republican Alternative Program, or CRAP for short. He never used that phrase, but I got to think like him, right? That was too crude for him. He was more of a gentleman than I am. But that was at the core of what really set him off to criticize Republicans and some conservatives who he thought threw in the towel too early.
Well, so this pickup, you mentioned Lugar and Indiana. Stan, at a very young age, as I mentioned, became first the editorial page editor, then the editor of the Indianapolis News. I want to start with maybe talking a little bit about when people think conservatism, they don't necessarily think Hoosiers. And yet, one of the best parts of your book is a passage where you get into the understated importance of Indiana to the American conservative movement. Could you explain that a little bit?
It came as, I'd never thought about it before, although when I started putting the pieces together, I said, of course, that makes all kinds of sense. You had, was it Daniel Mannion, is that his name? The longtime dean of the Notre Dame Law School?
Clarence Mannion.
Clarence Mannion. Daniel was his son, I think.
Yes.
Strong conservative, had a radio program, big presence in Indiana conservative politics. We had what became the Lilly Endowment, which was philanthropically on the right. And then you had the papers owned by the Pulliam family. Those were the anchor papers. He also owned the Arizona Republic, was father-in-law to Dan Quayle. And so it was this hotbed of conservative activity. Everybody thought in those years, 50s, 60s, it was Orange County and Texas, I guess. Right. But quite a lot of activity there in Indiana.
And later we get the alternative, later to be
Right.
known as the American
Right.
Spectator, which starts on the campus of
Right.
the University of Indiana at Bloomington.
Right, and Stan gave them a lot of help early on, not only in journalistic advice, but helping them raise some money to get it up and going.
And for years, the Hudson Institute had an Indiana office, and I'd always kind of looked, askance at that. It's like, what are they doing? But after reading this book, I realized it makes sense actually to have a presence in Indiana. Around the same time that he was taking this job, and this gets to Stan's role as an institution builder, he traveled to Sharon, Connecticut,
Right.
and the Buckley home at Great Elm, and participated in the formation of the Young Americans for Freedom, and was the principal author of the Sharon Statement, which is, I think, something every young conservative should memorize.
Yes.
But really, like I said in the intro, the credo of post-war American conservatism. Tell us about the Sharon Statement and Young Americans for Freedom.
The backstory for that, which you wouldn't necessarily know unless you've read 2 or 3 of the good histories of Young Americans for Freedom, is that it really began as an expression of the Youth for Goldwater in 1960. Because Goldwater made a big splash at the convention and gave the famous speech withdrawing his name from nomination, which he hadn't put in himself, and saying, "Grow up, conservatives." And it was overwhelmingly a youth movement for him. And it was Buckley, and I think his friend Marvin Liebman, who said afterwards, "We need to not let this energy among young conservatives dissipate. Let's have a meeting and let's start an organization." Buckley said, "I'll host it." And said to Stan, "You come, and I think you should write the statement of principles for what this organization is about." So Stan had drafted it, various accounts, either on the airplane on the way out, sort of shades of Lincoln writing the Gettysburg Address on right. And yeah, it's only 400 words, not much longer than the Gettysburg Address. I like to contrast it with the Port Huron statement of the SDS 2 years later that's 5,000 words and is completely unreadable and repetitive. And what's the one that's most remembered in the history books of the 60s, of course. And so what? I mean, I've not memorized it, but the point is it says 2 or 3 key points. One is he says, I'm stating, as it later puts it, the metaphysical principles of conservatism. But in the statement, it's eternal principles, eternal truths, transcendent principles. Some of them are very key, such as individual liberty, political liberty and economic liberty go together. You can't have one without the other. Anti-communist, of course. Limited government to protect our rights, and when a government goes beyond those limits, it starts eroding our rights. It's very straightforward, and Stan never boasted of his authorship of it, and whenever he was asked about it, the closest he'd come to say, I was only expressing or summarizing the timeless truths of conservatism, which is, narrowly speaking, correct, but he would never boast of his authorship of the document.
Mm-hmm. As I recall, there was one real dispute among these signatories, and that was whether God should be mentioned.
Yeah, I think the second or third short paragraph or sentence talks about our God-given rights, and Lee Edwards' recollection is that a vote on it of the roughly 100 people there was pretty close to include it. Some people thought we don't need God. It's that. So
God won.
God won. Yeah, as he usually does.
So he's building these institutions. He's running the Indianapolis News, and he's also a prolific writer. And one of the many joys of your book is the excerpts from his columns, and he wrote a series of columns where he was talked about a kind of a heuristic he had come up with called the Bohr baffler. What was the Bohr baffler? And then we can broaden it out to what many of us recall about Stan, which was his sense of humor.
Right, and so that's the thing about Stan. I say this early in the book is, if you just knew him from his writing or his radio commentaries, you had no idea how hilarious he could be. Very deadpan humor. He could have been a stand-up comic, I think, if he'd wanted to be, in that deadpan style that certain comics are very good at. And so it very seldom came through in his articles. But there are 2 or 3 exceptions. Before going to the Bohr baffler, there's one I do mention in the book. He put a straight news story in the Indianapolis News. This is important to his perceptions of media bias. And it was Goldwater, the losingest winner ever. And he talked about how the news media would represent that Goldwater had been really kind of a failure. I can't believe this candidate's succeeding. And Stan wrote in sort of mock straight news story, Goldwater failed in the latest primary, winning only 67% of the vote. And he pointed out later on, when McGovern ran in '72, Humphrey actually got more votes in the primaries. But the media narrative was he's this populist candidate, he's surging, even though he wasn't doing anywhere near as well as Goldwater did. Okay, the Board Baffler he wrote around 1960 or so, and it was about how to cope with cocktail parties and arranged to not be invited to more of them if he didn't want to go. And that's where he developed his legendary, or first rolled out his legendary sense of humor, where you take some liberal cliche and turn it on its head and state it with great seriousness, and people will either be aghast or take you seriously. So he rolled out there, later he did a slightly more refined form, but the final form of it was, I didn't agree with what Joe McCarthy was trying to do, but I sure admired his methods. Which I would say does the work of 10 op-ed articles piercing the pretensions and superficialities of liberals on anti-communism, right? He first rolled that one out in that article saying, if you say that, and he had a few other examples of liberal cliches, if you say that, and he said, always call your person Phil, whatever the person's name is. Well, you know, Phil, I think this and this. He says, you'll be guaranteed not to be invited to any more tedious cocktail parties if you do that.
This is in some ways a how-to book.
Yes.
So I plan to put the Bohr Baffler to use in the future. In 1961, you quote an interview he gave to Time magazine.
Yeah.
And he had a really remarkable quote. He says to Time magazine, this is Stan Evans, I think my philosophy is pretty close to the farmer in Seymour, Indiana. He believes in God, he believes in the United States, he believes in himself. The intuitive position, the instinctive position, is much closer to wisdom than the tortured theorems of some of our Harvard dons. To me, that sentence really gets to the heart of American conservatism. What is he saying there?
I think if to translate it in today's idiom, it would be a lot of wisdom in the heartland. He was very happy in Indiana. Even though, as you notice, and how much of this you want to go into, he wrote very sophisticated things for this evening newspaper out in what other people the coast would think of as the sticks. I was astonished to go through his journalism, because I'd never read any of it, and I was overwhelmed with the breadth and how deep it was in a lot of ways. But yeah, I mean, he thought that there was, and by the way, one of the things he said politically starting in the mid-60s is conservatism ought to have greater appeal for the working classes if conservatives will figure that out. And of course later, if he saw Reagan winning in California as an example of how that could be done, and of course then we had the Reagan Democrats in the 80s. So all that he foresaw in a lot of ways. And partly that was, there's how real people live, and then there's a lot more of his thoughts about the groupthink of the liberal establishment. I'm not sure he came up with that phrase, but he certainly popularized it in the mid-60s and had a serious critique behind it.
Let's talk about another institution he was crucial in the development of, and that is the Philadelphia Society, which was formed, I believe, in 1962 or 4.
64.
64, yeah. So around the time of the Goldwater election, and has held annual meetings, and you listened to many of these speeches, which they have very helpfully recorded and put up on the Philadelphia Society website for those people who are interested. I'm going to read you another quote from a speech he gave in 1967, where he said, "The founding fathers assumed a certain character type to exist in the United States, which would allow a regime of freedom to exist. The Great Society, that is LBJ's Great Society, assumes and encourages a lack of internal self-discipline, which makes people incapable of selecting purposes and incapable of organizing their behavior," close quote. So in just 2 or 3 sentences, he really encapsulates, I think, the view of American conservatism and contrasts it toward Great Society liberalism. How would you explain that?
Well, there's that. I think what needs to be understood is that Stan was a great fusionist, if you know that old term. That was always the effort to try and marry sort of libertarianism of pure open markets and maximum individual liberty with the more traditional Russell Kirk-style desire for virtue and traditional institutions. Stan thought, he hated the term fusionism, by the way. He didn't use it and criticized it, even though he was great friends with Frank Meyer and admired his project. And the reason he didn't like the terms, he said, the term presumes, again, it's accepting premises, the term assumes that these two different aspects of conservative thought are opposed to one another and need to be forced together in some artificial way. He thought they belonged together in harmony, or were naturally harmonious. And so that's why he would say, he did say a few times to politicians, but more broadly, and what he'd say today, I think, if he were with us, he'd say, if you think you're going to win just on social issues, that's a mistake. Like today, you know, everyone's, the Virginia governor's race and things like that we can point to today. And that's a mistake because it leaves the economic issues to the liberals and they'll continue. So they need to be contested on both grounds. On a deeper level, he thought you can't have individual virtue without a free economy. Oh, and one of the things he said about social issues is to libertarians was, look, if you say just ignore all those social issues, and I think we can really see this today, is what'll happen is he actually did use the phrase lifestyle liberalism a few times back in the 70s. That will lead, by degree, step by step, to more demands for bigger government, more regulation, more spending, because it will erode individual virtue. So that's why he was a traditionalist to a large extent. People used to describe, I'm sure it's in your book, used to describe conservatism as the three-legged stool. You know, economic conservatives, national security conservatives, and I guess. He was all three of those things at once, and he didn't think you needed three legs. They're all pillar, I guess.
I'll just pause here and remind those of you who may be joining us via the live stream that you can send questions to john.roach@aei.org, john.roach, R-O-A-C-H, at aei.org, or you can tweet your questions using the hashtag AIEvans, E-V-A-N-S. Just a note about fusionism, of course, it's one of those terms that is initially used as a pejorative, and then it gets adopted. I think that the first person to actually say fusionism was Brent Bozell in his attack on Frank Meyer's position. And Frank Meyer, the chief theoretician of the National Review in the 1950s and 1960s, who tried to provide a theoretical account of what he saw conservatives living out every day around him, used in just a throwaway line in one of his essays this idea that libertarian ideas had been fused to traditionalist ones. And in his critique of Meyer, Bozell, who believed that this fusion could not exist, described it as such. So it's funny how that comes into play, as you will find people in nerdy circles identify themselves as fusionists. I want to move on. So we're in this 1960s. We've talked about Goldwater. We've talked about the Philadelphia Society, Young Americans for Freedom, the youth movement. And yet, in 1968, the Republican who is elected to the presidency is Richard Nixon, who is not a conservative. In fact, there's a great line from Stans that you have in your book where he says, there are only two things I dislike about the Nixon administration, his domestic policy and his foreign policy. So I guess the first thing I would say, why didn't Stan Evans like Richard Nixon? And then I would follow up as if you could explain to us who the Manhattan 12 were.
Yeah, right. That's really a forgotten episode. You know, it's not entirely clear to me why Stan disliked Nixon. I have a few hints. Partly he's following his good friend William Rusher, who really detested Nixon always. I think what it goes back to is Nixon, as the legend goes, you know, striking the bargain with Nelson Rockefeller in 1960 to have a liberal planks in the platform, which Evans thought you didn't need. In 68, he thought, in fact, coming out of the convention, Stan attended all the conventions of both parties as a journalist for many of those years. He thought the conservatives had won the political battle in the Republican Party in 68, but he distrusted that Nixon was going to follow through on it. And what he said was, you know, we get the words, liberals get the victories. So by the time you get to, some of his best jokes were about Nixon, not just that one, but several others. I'll have to try and share one or two. By the time you get to 1970-71, Evans thought the arms control policy was unsound. You know, arms talks with the Soviet Union, especially the ABM treaty, getting rid of missile defense, which we didn't have much of anyway, but that got rid of even having any idea of it. Didn't like the opening to China. Didn't like the way Vietnam was going. And then, of course, later, we had wage and price controls. Oh, the family assistance plan, which would have federalized welfare, the guaranteed annual income. Didn't like any of those things. Stan liked to joke in later years that a true conservative didn't support Nixon until after Watergate. And one of his jokes was this, after wage and price controls, Watergate was a breath of fresh air. So he had a whole bunch of those. He did, by the way, to go to the end of the story, thought Nixon was tossed from office in ways we'd come to regret.
Right.
Okay. So I think it was along about 70 or 71, Buckley called a meeting of leading conservatives, and they gathered to decide to make a public statement suspending support, that was the phrasing, of Nixon. In other words, they're putting him on probation. Buckley himself didn't join it. Is that right? No, it was his brother who was in the Senate by then, didn't join it, but Buckley did. So Evans wrote the statement for the Manhattan 12, it was called, although he didn't himself sign it, and I think that was because his publisher, Eugene Pulliam, was very pro-Nixon and he didn't want to get crossways with the boss. That's just a guess on my part. And so that was a big splash. Conservatives suspending support for Nixon. Evans supported John Ashbrook's sort of gonzo challenge to Nixon that went nowhere in '72. And then, as I say, when Watergate came along, Stan did not change his opinion of Nixon politically, but thought that today we'd say the deep state and some of the other things that come along that now look a little stronger than they did then in some ways, I think. Mm-hmm. I think we're going to have an interesting reckoning with that here in June when the 50th anniversary of Watergate arrives. And so he then, as I say, he wasn't entirely joking when he says he didn't support Nixon until after Watergate. He thought he did face unfair criticism from the media and the establishment in Washington. And I mentioned earlier, the White House took it seriously, invited several of them in to meet with Henry Kissinger. I think Kissinger must have taped the meeting because his memo that was declassified later just reads too accurate to have been someone taking notes. And he and Stan really tangled, politely but firmly.
Some of the demands that they were making, the Manhattan 12, one of them, they demanded that Agnew stayed on the ticket,
yes,
correct? Vice President Agnew, they wanted to make sure he was there. They wanted more money for defense, I think, was another one. And yet the conservatives found themselves in this awkward position where they had staked out this position on principle, and yet they're confronted in the 1972 election with the alternatives of Richard Nixon and George McGovern. And so I'll give you the opportunity to give Stan's great line on George McGovern.
Right. Yeah, this was so obvious you can't believe no one thought of it. That government is best which McGoverns least.
Yes, one of my favorites.
One of his classics. Right.
So the 72 election, of course, ends with a personal landslide for Richard Nixon, but it's a weird election in that the Republican victor has very few, almost negative coattails. They actually lose 2 seats in the Senate that year. One of the senators who lost that year was Senator Gordon Allott of Colorado,
who
employed a former political scientist named George Will. And after the election, George Will called William F. Buckley Jr. and said, "I need a job. Can you give me one?" And Buckley said, "You do need a job, and I will give you one." And they made George Will the Washington correspondent of National Review magazine. Just as Watergate began to consume the city and to consume the Nixon presidency. So I'd like you to talk a little bit about Stan's views of George Will, and then maybe broaden it out toward where does George fit into the conservative movement in its history? Because in many ways, some of the things that Stan Evans has said about George Will in 1973 and 1974 are things that other conservatives are saying about him
now,
today.
Right? Well, I'll say this about Stan generally. He was quite a prophet in many ways on a whole lot of issues. I think the thing to say is that Stan tended to live by the 11th commandment applied to conservatives. Thou shalt not speak ill of a fellow conservative. And actually, he never really said anything publicly unpleasant about Will. I know privately he didn't care for him. And he did have a very sharp review of his book in 1983, Statecraft and Soulcraft. And the irony there is Will later came to repudiate the book himself. And Will is, in Stan's late book, 1996, The Theme was Freedom, there's a couple of paragraphs where he clearly has Will in mind in Will's account of the American founding. He doesn't name him. So it was always very polite that way, and he was such a nice man. He got along with everybody. But Will rubbed him the wrong way. One of his other subtle attacks one time, without naming Will, because Will was always about the metaphysics of baseball, Stan one day at a Philadelphia Society meeting says, "I'm not any good at this sports stuff. I always thought that baseball was a metaphor for softball. So, and then he went on and expanded that even more in a very funny way. I think he thought that Will was, on particular issues, they were often in agreement, arms control and many other things. I think he thought Will fell into that category of people who accepted too many of the premises of the Washington community. I think that was, and he did think Will's account of the American founding and statecraft to soulcraft was defective. I heard reports from various people, I couldn't quite nail it down, that they did have something of a shouting match, supposedly at the University of Indiana in the early 70s, over the subject of Agnew. Because Will had publicly said, I think in National Review, Agnew should be removed, his vice president should be dropped from the ticket or something like this. And
that was a case of him being prophetic.
Yes. Well, in a certain way.
Agnew removed himself.
Right,
eventually.
that's right. Yeah. That would have been when Stan was still in his early 30s. And so I heard that from several different people, but nobody can quite place it. I couldn't find a record of it anywhere.
And it led to some tension within National Review.
Yes, yeah. Again, I hear all this secondhand and was not able to find any correspondence or documents on it, but I think Stan wanted to be the new books editor when Frank Meyer died.
In 72, yes.
72,
yeah.
Right.
And then Frank Meyer's widow took it over briefly, but
Right.
then tragically she committed suicide, which led to George Will taking the position as well.
Yeah, of course, Stan was still in Indianapolis then, and I think, just a guess here, Buckley wanted somebody in Washington or New York doing it. And they were estranged for a while, but then Stan returned to the fold, writing several different regular features for National Review. He did a lawmakers column that was always about the nuts and bolts of something going on Capitol Hill. He did the Dark Horses book column, which I always thought was interesting. I remember reading at the time when I was a student and later, it was often obscure books from academics or often a government report that no one had heard about that would have the information that contradicted the prevailing wisdom on something. I always marvel at how does he have time to read and write all the stuff he does and go to bars for rock and roll trivia contests, which he was legendary for. So that was a short-term estrangement, I think.
Yes, and I guess in some ways it resolved itself because Will left National Review in 1975, I believe, with his Newsweek column.
Right.
Let's talk a little bit about another institution that Stan was very involved with in the 1970s, and that was the American Conservative Union, which he chaired. And Stan was actually the motive force behind the first Conservative Political Action Conference held in the winter of 1974. Talk about how the importance of Cpac during that period and how he might view Cpac today.
Oh, yes, I've wondered about that. Back up one step.
Sure.
Although he wasn't in on he was on the outskirts of founding ACU in, I think, 65. He'd long called for something like that back in the late 50s. And a lot of columns then in Human Events and elsewhere, he'd said, look at what the Democrats do with Americans for Democratic Action. And then he followed that closely and would critique it. He says, the conservatives need something just like it. And that was ACU. And then he became its president in 1970 or 71. And being the practically minded person he is, really built it up substantially. And then, 74, he got the feeling that conservatives were dejected at the Watergate disaster. So we need to have, he didn't say it this way, but need to have a party or a serious meeting. And he got outgoing Governor Reagan to agree to come as their headliner, but then, they had no mailing list. And he was joking to his staff, go get bums off the street if you have to, because we need a crowd for Governor Reagan. So the first Cpac was not clear it was going to be a success. It ended up being a great success. I think 600 people for the dinner for Reagan, that was the highlight of it. The early Cpac, when Stan was running ACU till I think 78 or 79, it was a mix of politicians and political theater, you might say. We always had panels that would resemble an American Enterprise Institute panel. He would have, George Stigler and Yale Brosen come from Chicago to talk about antitrust and the economy, and foreign policy experts to talk about what's going on in foreign policy. Very different from the Cpac today, which is kind of show business, right?
Celebrity-driven.
Celebrity-driven. It's moved out of Washington. Stan's last appearance at Cpac, coincidentally, was 2013, which is the same one Donald Trump spoke at to great acclaim. And Stan there was saying things that became very familiar to us. In particular, immigration's out of hand. Funny about that, right? And he also said some other things that were, I think, prophetic at that last appearance. Again, if he didn't like the turn it took toward this more celebrity-driven, he never said so.
And he also had a role in Reagan's challenge to Ford in 1976. I mean, people kind of forget, since we kind of ascribe this inevitability to Reagan's rise, how just wild it was that the former governor of California would challenge the sitting Republican president.
Right.
So what part did Stan play in that?
Yeah, that was a very close run thing. Reagan came out of the box strong, except he lost most of the early primaries. Mm-hmm. And it looked like he was finished going to North Carolina. He was out of money, down on the polls. And in fact, if he'd lost North Carolina, that he probably would have withdrawn. The Ford people were quietly negotiating behind the scenes with Reagan's people about what they could do to help him withdraw, pay off campaign debts, the usual kinds of things. And by coincidence, this was right after the Supreme Court's Berkeley v. Vallejo decision, which Stan was a plaintiff in, as one of many, and that allowed independent expenditures. So right away, the American Conservative Union decided, let's go in big for Reagan in North Carolina. Jesse Helms had his own operation going, doing the same thing, and lo and behold, Reagan wins an upset in North Carolina. The whole campaign turns around, and Reagan wins most of the remaining primaries and comes within a hair of knocking off Ford at the convention in Kansas City. Some people say, and I think it's a plausible argument, you can't know for sure, that but for that intervention on behalf of Reagan, he would have lost, and that would have been the end of the line for him. Yeah. So Jameson, and Stan was always too modest. Again, he'd say, well, yeah, we did that, but so did Jesse Helms, and of course Reagan himself, true. Ultimately, it all depends on him. But Jameson campaign says, no Evans in 76, no Reagan in 80.
So during the Reagan period in your biography, you talk about how Stan began training young journalists. He'd always had proteges since the human events years that you bring out. But this is when he really started in earnest creating institutions in order to train conservative journalists. And you were one of those young people who went through his boot camp. One of his lessons was the first duty of a newspaper, he said, is to cover your own backyard. What were some of the other lessons you may have learned from him?
Well, facts above opinion. No one's interested in your opinion. In fact, he really wanted to train reporters to the extent that he could, or if you were going to be an opinion journalist, he wanted you to be a fact-based opinion journalist, but also with some depth of understanding of how the world worked, especially economics. He used to do Friday seminars explaining some basic economics I had a pretty good grounding in it, but a lot of students didn't. I think maybe the most interesting story about his, not contrary understanding of journalism, but it's one he told that was, I thought, excellent and very little followed. He'd say, if your beat is some subject and there's a hearing on Capitol Hill, go to the hearing. It's amazing how many people don't do that. They'll take a committee report or call somebody. But then there was one more step. He'd say, you go to the hearing, it's on maybe health care. Ted Kennedy's the chair. The hearing will end, and all the reporters will rush up to Ted Kennedy to get a quote because he's Ted Kennedy. He says, what you should do if you want a really good story and a deeper story, watch the hearing, look for the person sitting behind Kennedy who is passing him papers, who's giving him questions. Says that will be the staff person, either with the committee or in the senator's office, who really knows what's going on and what the issues are. You go interview that person, and that's the person that will give you a better story and one different from the herd mentality of the regular press. It makes perfect sense when you think about it, and how little is that practiced?
Another is his focus on, and you mentioned this, on government reports.
Yes.
That just seem to be circulating in the ether, but no one pays any attention to them.
Right.
But if you do, you can really get some good stories out of it. And I'm always surprised that some of the best journalism that we produced when I edited the Washington Free Beacon, for example, was public information.
Right.
But no one had the energy or the insight to put it together.
So, one thing we skipped over, because it was brief, is Stan did do a year of graduate work with Ludwig von Mises. So Stan wasn't just, he'd been a literature major at Yale, but he wasn't just economically sound on principle, he was numerate. So the only other journalist I can think of from that era who was like him was Warren Brooks, who died 30 years ago. Warren Brooks had a table or a graph in every article he ever wrote. Stan didn't always have one with every article, but he quite often would have a chart or a table or a graph or explain the numbers in a very approachable way because, like I say, he was numerate. And that's also a rare thing in journalism, I think.
I guess Twitter for him would be good for his one-liners.
Oh my goodness, yes.
But it does detract from putting together the visualizations and the hard reporting into the government documents. I'm going to begin to turn to some of your questions, and they are very good. And I'll just remind people who are joining us via the live stream, you can email those questions to john.roach, R-O-A-C-H, @aei.org, or include the hashtag AEIEvans if you want to tweet them. One question asks how Evans might respond to the contemporary writers who are pronouncing the death of fusionism. And I think maybe one way to get into this question is to talk about Stan's book from 1994, The Theme of Freedom.
Yeah.
Could you give us a little bit of his argument there, and then how it might apply to some of the debates over the relationship between social and economic conservatives today?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think that book holds up very well as a neglected classic. And by the way, it's the other thing that convinces me that if he had pursued an academic career, he would have been as distinguished and notable as Eric Vogelin or Russell Kirk, or if economics, like Milton Friedman even. But instead he took the journalistic path. But he still had a great depth. And what he does in that book is say, he tries to knit together a lot of strands that a lot of scholars, I think, have ignored about the rise of individual liberty and democratic government. In particular, he thought that a lot of the I shouldn't say conventional histories, but take our friends the Straussians, or take Gordon Wood, or old what's-his-name at Harvard years ago. They all have excellent accounts of the founding, but they're partial. Stan thought they left out the importance of the Bible and the biblical tradition. He thought they shortchanged the Romans. Our Straussian friends, they love Greece. They kind of skip over Rome. He thought that was a mistake. He thinks the common law tradition in England is much more important for America than most people give it credit for. So we weaved all this together in a very readable way, but also a very serious way. I counted up all his sources in his footnotes and his bibliography, and I forget what the numbers were, but they were quite large. He read everything from every corner, and including drawing from some people who otherwise considered kind of exotic, but who he found in places to be sound. Like, what's his name, Rushdoony, who's otherwise thought of as a sort of a loony theocrat. And Stan, I'm not sure what Stan thought of him. I never thought to ask him about it, but he spotted some things that he and his son-in-law, Gary North, who just passed away a while ago, thought were really on to something that everybody else had missed, and he was not afraid to cite them and point in their direction.
And so when you look at what people are discussing about fusionism today, did Stan anticipate some of these arguments? In some ways, the arguments being made that American conservatism is too libertarian or too focused on economic freedom, these are the same arguments that Brent Bozell was making in the 60s, right?
Yeah.
How did he respond to that?
Well, I'd say two things that have come back to me a lot lately while working on this and looking at our current scene. In the late 70s, he noted the rise of the neoconservatives. He actually started seeing this as early as the mid-60s with people like Moynihan. He wrote about them at the Indianapolis News. In the 70s, when they really started coming into their own with commentary and so forth, he said this is a welcome addition to the conservative movement. But here and there, there was an undertone of a bit of hesitation about it, that there were still probably social scientists, that's one way of putting it. Second thing he said was what I said earlier about conservatism can appeal to the working class. But, he said, this is as early as the mid-70s, we have to be cautious about trying to be welfare state light and offering our own big government goodies for the working class. Because our appeal to traditional values and an economy of opportunity ought to be sufficient to get their votes. I think he'd be very skeptical of some of the talks some friends of ours have these days about needing industrial policy. Mm-hmm. I think he'd find that unsound. I think I know what joke he would tell, by the way.
Oh. Can we repeat it in public?
Well, yeah. I think he'd say, gosh, this sounds an awful lot like socialism to me, but I guess if it's national socialism, it's probably okay. I think that would be, that's pretty much his style.
That's definitely the, that will get you disinvited from dinner parties if you say that.
I think, isn't that what he might say, right? It sounds like him. So there's that hesitation about it. The third one is this came, not really as a surprise, but for someone who was so anti-communist, so pro-defense most of the time, you can pick up undertones as early as the late 50s, throughout the 60s, and then after 2001, that he had some sympathy with the old Robert Taft non-interventionist view. And he got that from Chattarov, I think, partly. And I think he muted that to some extent during the Cold War, one, out of practical necessity, two, especially when it came to Vietnam, where his line on it was quite interesting, not wanting to give any aid and comfort to the anti-war left. But after 2001, you started picking up then that he thought our whole foreign policy establishment was out of its mind and had done more harm than good. And although he never came out in opposition to the Iraq War, there was an undertone of criticism. Even the first Gulf War he thought was perhaps ill-advised.
I was going to say, and someone asked a very good question from the audience, his relationship to Patrick Buchanan.
Yeah.
And Buchanan in the 1990s kind of reviving that Taftian tradition of what's been called disengaged nationalism. Where did Stan fall in the arguments with Pat Buchanan? Because from what I'm hearing from you, from his comment at Cpac in 2013, from his skepticism at the direction of American foreign policy after 9/11, it sounds like he was kind of falling into the Buchanan brigades.
With one important distinction, Stan did say clearly more than once, he repudiated the view sometimes associated with Buchanan, fairly or not, that Israel was too influential in the making of American foreign policy. He directly rejected that. He turned it away the other way around. He says, I am not sure that a lot of our foreign policy in the Middle East is actually helpful to Israel. That's one place where he was not in the Buchanan camp or Joe Sobran. He knew pretty well. And then, but this goes back to the 50s. He thought our foreign policy establishment was gripped by groupthink, and a lot of our foreign policy was simply an extension of liberal ideas of domestic policy, and so he hated foreign aid. It wasn't the amounts of money involved, but the premise behind it that we can buy the loyalty and progress of foreign countries by giving them money. So it was those kind of things that were on his mind.
Another audience member asks, for such a principled man and a consistent man in his thinking, were there any issues on which he changed his mind? And maybe I present it to you this way. When we speak of William F. Buckley Jr., who also defended Joe McCarthy, wrote an entire book, McCarthy and His Enemies. Later in his life, Buckley would say that McCarthy was a huge blow to the cause of anti-communism. And yet that would not be Stan's answer necessarily. So let me maybe ask you first, were there things that he changed his mind about? And then let's talk about one of his last two books of revisionist history.
Yeah, so, one particular issue where he was a little quirky was healthcare. Now, one of his late jokes was, we have to repeal Obamacare to find out what's not in it.
Yeah,
of course.
That one.
But he understood early on. He understood in 1965 that Medicare and Medicaid, it wasn't just the government takeover or government socialism. It was going to wreck the entire healthcare sector, including the private insurance scheme. And so into the 90s, he opposed Hillary Care, of course, but in the later 90s, he was saying to conservatives and Republicans, you ought not to be automatically closed-minded to government regulation of HMOs, because essentially what the government has done with 40 years of interventions into the healthcare market that now renders the whole thing open. I'm sure we all get these statements from, you can't understand them, right? And this is the only major commodity you can think of where you can't find out a price for something. He thought conservatives should not be automatically opposed to government, even federal regulation of HMOs, because the government had corrupted them and offloaded rationing onto them, and that was bad for consumers. So that was kind of interesting. That's not the straightforward free market answer you might expect.
That wouldn't be von Mises's answer.
Would not be von Mises's answer, correct, yeah. And he actually supported, I think in the late 90s, a Democratic proposal to impose some healthcare regulations, and said this is one, very rare for him, and one said this is where conservatives should cooperate with the Democrats in coming up with an effective regulatory system. Hard to mention very many others like that. On McCarthy, I think he just got tired of all the media and historical exaggerations and mistakes. a lot of his book, Blacklisted by History, is simply correcting the historical record and showing that claims about him were just factually wrong. And that, in fact, people that the media and historians for years have said were innocent victims were, in fact, real communists, that they weren't at all. His research was exhausting, isn't even strong enough, but one of the defenses made of some of McCarthy's targets were, well, they weren't at the State Department anymore. So he went and found an old State Department telephone book in an archives out somewhere in a warehouse in Maryland. People were still listed in the State Department phone book at the same time. So he went to that kind of depth to debunk a lot of claims. He didn't say McCarthy was right about everything. He didn't, I mean, he agreed with Buckley. He made lots of mistakes, caused lots of damage with some of his imprudence and lack of discipline, but thought he deserved a better shake than he's ever gotten.
But that also kind of led to some sundered friendships when he published that book. It was not met with unanimous praise when he published Blacklisted by History.
Well, Ann Coulter called it the greatest book since the Bible.
That's true, Ann did. Ann loves it.
I love that. I mean,
But she, in many ways, she's a party of one.
well, she was also an intern for Stan.
Yeah.
A handful, she was described
Absolutely.
by people there at the time. I think the biggest breach was with Ron Radosh, who reviewed it very harshly in National Review, which was really a surprise. Was that after Buckley had died? I can't, or he maybe had retreated from the magazine, but very surprising that they would do that. And Stan's initial letter to the editor was, Neil Friedman told me, was toned down on the advice of his friends. I thought it was sort of unworthy of National Review to write that harsh a review. And Radosh sort of insinuated that he plagiarized people. And it turns out Stan had sent the manuscript to the people that... So it was kind of a train wreck, and that was unfortunate.
You know, another questioner observes that here he was, for most of his career, based in Indiana, yet keeping up in Washington. And also, even though it was a Pulliam paper, it was, it was a major paper. It was, so I guess part one would be, how did he keep up to date on situations in Washington from his place in Indiana?
I mean, it should be mentioned, he did move here finally in 1974 or 5.
Okay.
His journalism career was taking off even more. The LA Times picked him up to be nationally syndicated. His joke was, I wanted to be moved to be closer to my money. Or as he'd like to say about Washington, Washington's just like the Soviet Union, but without the amenities. He had great fun with that. He was always getting parking tickets, getting his car towed. So that, he lived here briefly in the 50s, working for Human Events. But very early on, I think almost right away, he bought a house out in Hamilton, out in the countryside. And that's where he spent his retirement years. But he'd go out there on the weekends. And I think that was his way of getting out of the Beltway bubble. By the way, he never dressed like a Washington person, or very seldom. He wore turtlenecks in the 80s. I mean, sort of years after that was a plausible fashion thing. And he always drove kind of beat up cars.
He's still kind of there identifying with the farmer from Seymour,
yes,
right?
Right.
And then too, here he is, he's a newspaper journalist. He does do the Spectrum Radio broadcasts, but he's a syndicated columnist. He's someone who's kind of ensconced in the mainstream media, even though he is a critic of it and of its biases. How do you think he would view conservative media today? Or did he ever express opinions to you about Fox News and Drudge Report and PowerlineBlog.com?
Yeah. He was a big fan of Rush Limbaugh. Used to listen as often as he could and talk to Rush a few times. I never heard him talk about Fox News. I think the last time I saw him, I'm going to say, was 2009, 2010, which is, I mean, it was a known quantity by then, but it hadn't become the flashpoint that it's been the last few years, right? So I don't know. I think he was encouraged by it. One thing back up a step. The National Journalism Center had 2 parts to it. You'd spend 6 weeks in the office working on a research and writing project in-house, and then and this was a way to double the number of people you could have. The other 6 weeks, you would be out as an intern at a media organization. Well, as conservative media started growing, that meant more opportunities to place people at good places. So I think he was much encouraged by all of that. My hunch about it is he would still think that, by the way, he always said, we're not necessarily trying to teach conservative journalists, and he had a few liberals or nondescript people come through, like Malcolm Gladwell was an intern at NJC. I don't know what his ideology is. And Terry Moran, later of ABC News, is kind of a conventional liberal journalist. He wanted journalists to have higher quality in their standards, like we were saying about earlier. And so I think he would caution. He did kind of make an early version of this argument when I was around 40-some years ago now. He would caution you about settling into an ideological bubble that predetermined your thought. I think that's what he would not warn, but caution people about if they're working at the Free Beacon or Fox News or anywhere.
And then, too, there's that emphasis on facts, right?
Yes,
Factuality,
right. Yes.
Verifiable data,
Right.
Empirical data, as opposed to, say, spewing hot air.
Right.
We have just a few minutes left. I did want to have you talk briefly about Stan's turn toward religion toward the end of his life. For someone who talked about how important Christianity was to the formation of the United States, he himself was not very observant until the end of his life. What happened there, you think?
Right. Couple things. One is, he was always defending the religious right, as it was called. Mm-hmm. Always defending them. He was always opposed to abortion from even before Roe versus Wade. Stuck up for traditional marriage. Did say it was difficult for the government to regulate things. I think there was some symposium question he answered for Policy Review in the 80s. Should the government prohibit cohabitation or something really exotic? And he said, no, that's a crazy idea. I don't think it's a good idea, but no way should government go near that. Okay. The other part is, his favorite vegetable, he liked to say, was a cigarette, a leafy vegetable. And he was a drinker. He liked his bourbon. He liked rock and roll. And he might have thought that he didn't quite match up to some of the public image of certain religious figures. And so the extent that he said, I've always thought of myself as a Christian, but as probably a bad one or not the most exemplary example of one. So he never publicly made professions of faith. He did describe his book, The Theme is Freedom, as something of a Catholic book. And I think the way he talked about the importance of the Bible to developments, including things like the common law in the Middle Ages in Britain and elsewhere, and even to Roman law to a certain extent, I think made him realize that what he thought was the transcendent foundations of, the order of the universe, you might say, was, he always thought it was real, but it's suddenly, and I think partly too, he was ill with cancer, and I think that comes into play too. Mm-hmm. He had known a number of Catholic clergy, including one priest who went and visited him a lot in hospital, someone he'd actually encouraged to study Thomas Aquinas. Mm-hmm. Years earlier. So I think it was always latent there. And so late in life, he decided to get the last rites from a Catholic priest in the hospital out near Hamilton.
Just a few more minutes now. I want to ask you your favorite Stan line. I'm going to give mine first.
Okay.
It's hard, but my favorite, I have two. One is, we know that, Irving Kristol used to say, or responding to the cliche that a conservative is a liberal who's been mugged.
Oh, right.
Irving Kristol said that a neoconservative is a liberal who's been mugged by reality. Right. To which Stan replied, a paleoconservative is a conservative who's been mugged by a neoconservative.
Yeah.
That one I had not heard before, but I like it. And then my other favorite from your book is, Stan would tell audiences, I have the heart of a liberal. I keep it in a jar on my desk. What are your favorites?
Yeah, that one's been around a while. Yeah. I don't know if he thought of it, but he certainly popularized it. It's hard to pick one, but I think the one that I've liked the most, I like a lot of those Nixon ones, but the one I like these days, since I'm an inmate at a college campus, is young conservatives had to get over the Goldwater defeat without grief counselors. Which, yeah, okay. I don't need to explain the backstory to that these days.
Well, thank you again for writing this book, and which also, maybe we have a couple more minutes. You can in the book there are two appendices. One is Great Lines. Another is his guide to political combat.
Yeah.
Just briefly, what was he doing? What kind of rules did he have to tell people engaging in political activity?
Yeah, well, he had 6 of them, and I mentioned the most important one earlier, which is do not accept the premise of the Washington establishment or the Washington community about any issue. You know, one of them also was Washington is not America. That's a correlative principle to the first one, right? One of them is pretty simple. Fighting is better than not fighting. Too often, people don't fight about things, or they throw in the towel. His last one was taxes are Trumps. Not that Trump, but it's I don't know. Sometimes we give up. Oh, he did like to say, taxes are kind of like sex. When it's good, it's great, and when it's bad, it's still pretty good. But he thought you should never give up on liberalism means higher taxes everywhere and always, and keep that front and center all the time. So,
rules to keep in mind. Stan used to say, my time is up, thank you for yours. And so on behalf of Steve and myself, our time is up. Thank you for yours. And this is the end of this event. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt.
Thank you,
Thanks.
Steve.